Hey everyone, Chat Sematary is back. I'm your host, Deanna Chapman, and I am joined by Tim Mathews. Today we're talking about 11/22/63, the Hulu adaptation that came out in 2016. Before we dive in, though, Tim and I are both aware of the allegations against James Franco and that some stuff was settled. And while we do have to talk about James Franco because he is the star of this show, if it's something you don't want to listen to, we totally understand. Tim, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. Excited to talk about some Stephen King, some JFK, some conspiracy, It's always a good time, I guess.
It's one of those things where this is by far the probably most heavily researched King novel because of how much it is relying on actual factual history to tell its story despite the story still being fictional.
Yeah, when I was reading about trying to read up on some stuff after I finished rewatching the series, I saw, I guess there was Stephen King had like some idea of, he was really a fan of these characters and thought about, how could I continue it? But part of why he didn't was, nerves of trying to follow up something that was so beloved. And the other was he mentioned just how like intensive the research of there's real people involved, there's real timeline of events, and then you're adding time travel into it and trying to make sure that he kind of covers his bases so that you don't have some realistic fact not correct, and then all of a sudden all your fantasy stuff is going to fall apart, which is time travel's hard enough.
Right. And one interesting thing about the book is that he had started writing this when he was like 24 and it was under a different name, and he kind of abandoned it because of how much he was sort of diving into real history as well. And obviously I'm glad he returned to it, but there's also a bit of a funny story as to how this all got started, because there was a moment in time where this was supposed to just be a feature film, and Jonathan Demme, who did The Silence of the Lambs, was the one who wanted to make it into a feature film. But then King ended up getting in touch with J.J. Abrams, and J.J. got involved with it. And then, apparently Franco had tried to contact King about doing a show or movie for this, and JJ basically beat him to it. But then JJ had read James Franco's review of the book that I guess was published in Vice, and then asked Franco to be the lead in this. So kind of a wild turn of events there, from going from Jonathan Demme to what we see on the screen for the Hulu adaptation.
Absolutely. Yeah, I saw that, Franco apparently was such a huge fan of the book and the character as well, and identified with different aspects of the character. And so it is pretty wild how it all kind of seems to have worked out the way it was supposed to. I didn't know that it was going to potentially be a film. We mentioned, prior to recording, I haven't read the book, but I have put it on my desk several times and seen how long it is. And this series is 8 episodes? I just can't imagine what you would trim to make this fit in a movie. I just cannot imagine it working.
Especially considering they took out a pretty huge chunk of the book already.
I would imagine, yeah.
We'll get to that in a bit, because it's a very specific thing that they took out that comes to play at the beginning and towards the end of the book. But I think one of the things that stood out to me was really the supporting cast. You have James Franco in the lead role as Jake Amberson, or Jake Epping, if you will. And then you have Sarah Gadon. I'm not 100% sure which way her last name is pronounced, but she plays Sadie Dunhill. You have George McKay as Bill, Chris Cooper as Al Templeton. You have Cherry Jones playing Lee Harvey's mother. You have Daniel Weber playing Lee Harvey Oswald. You also have a Josh Duhamel appearance for, half of the episodes. You have Tanya Pinkins playing Ms. Mimi, and you have just so many familiar faces. And then you have Gil Bellows coming into play for 2 episodes, and he was in The Shawshank Redemption. So he's someone who's returning, and you know me, I like to pick those things out when covering the adaptations because so many people have returned, and you have, Leon Rippey, who has been in tons of stuff as Harry Dunning, and it's just so many familiar faces that, it wasn't even James Franco's performance for me that made me like this. And we'll talk about some of the problems because I actually liked this less on a second watch than I did the first time around. And I think it's because the first time around I had not read the book yet.
That's fair. Yeah, the cast is extraordinary. And Daniel Weber as Lee Harvey Oswald does such a great job in that role. Yes, Sarah Gideon. She is absolutely wonderful as Sadie, forever charming. She can reach the emotions that just leave you feeling gut wrenched while you're sitting there watching her performance on screen. It's the range of so many of these characters. George McKay as Bill, absolutely. I know I had forgotten from the first time I watched because I watched it when it first came out, and then I watched it again for the podcast. So it's been quite a while, and I kind of totally forgotten about Bill's part in this. And so as that was unfolding, I found myself just completely enthralled by that storyline all over again. And you can't have a Stephen King adaptation without somebody who has been in a prior Stephen King adaptation. It's like almost a rule.
Sometimes it really does feel that way. And, there's some upcoming stuff where I'm like, oh, these people are all back. And, it's always fun to make those connections. But story-wise, I kind of want to kick this off with talking about some of the differences because you mentioned Bill and how prominent his character is, despite both of us kind of forgetting about that whole storyline. But in the book, Bill is 1, much older, and 2, does not travel with Jake.
Oh, wow. So that's a pretty huge addition then to the story.
Yeah, so his character is kind of acting like a proxy so that the story is kind of taken out of Jake's head.
Yeah, you always see that in, kind of really anything. You see it a lot with the, even like the superhero stuff. The man in the chair, or person in the chair, what have you, is kind of always seems to be a character that gets placed in there so that the main character, who's usually off on their own, has somebody to talk to and maybe bounce some, the typical dialogue that they might say, in their head in narration if they don't want to go in a narration route, which can be dicey. Sometimes it's really cool and sometimes not. It's probably a good idea that they didn't do that with this one. And I really enjoyed the addition of Bill. So when I do get around to reading the book, that's kind of a bummer, but it also makes it exciting to know that there's going to, obviously I knew there would be so much in the book that's not in the show, but it's exciting that there's like key plot stuff that'll be different. So I may not know what to expect.
Yeah. So one of the other things that ties to Bill is, he's in Holden, Kentucky, and that's where Harry's family lives when he's a young boy. And all of that storyline in the book takes place in Derry.
I did hear that Derry was kind of this whole like segment of the book, and I did spoil that for myself. Which, while it is such a cool sounding tie-in, I guess it does kind of make sense if you want this to be more of a standalone thing and not feel like audiences need to. On one hand, maybe you don't want audiences to kind of be like, oh, what's going on here? And on the other hand, if you start to introduce some of those aspects from that scene, audiences may be bummed out if it doesn't go kind of all in on it, because it is such a prominent feature. I was trying to dance around it. I didn't know how much you wanted to openly say.
Well, it's just odd to me that they would cut out this entire storyline being in this very Stephen King specific place that has so much history within his novels, because Jake is from Maine. Harry is a janitor at his school. It doesn't really make sense for him to grow up in small town Kentucky and then just end up in a random small town in Maine years later.
Yeah, I guess I can see that too. I would have been personally fine with it if they included it, but I would imagine if they felt they didn't have the time to give that storyline, maybe that's why they took it out of there. Maybe it was a rights thing. Who knows how those contracts work from time to time.
Well, plus they take out the whole storyline with Jake meeting a couple of the kids from It.
Right. And I think you definitely, you easily could have kept Derry in there, even if you cut out all of that stuff, because, I mean, how many times do things just take place in Derry? And if you don't mention anything other than Derry, then no one's going to bat an eye. So it is interesting that they didn't call it Derry.
If JJ and Hulu were able to do a Castle Rock show, I don't see why they wouldn't have been able to include Derry, because, Castle Rock's appeared in so many other adaptations. I don't know if you can necessarily own the rights to a fictional city.
I'm trying to think. In 2016, was this made in 2016? I know 2016's in the show.
It's when it came out, and also that's another difference because the book takes place the year the book came out.
Right, yeah. So the only thing I could think of is because wasn't the new It in 2016?
2017.
That was 2017. So I wonder if maybe there was, I just feel like there's so many weird type of rights of like, well, you can't use this because we're using it right now, which doesn't really make sense, but I can only imagine there was just some weird contract thing, because otherwise I can't really think why they wouldn't want to use it. I would imagine if they were allowed to, they would. And then Castle Rock came out later,
Well, they made a lot of changes that didn't really make sense to me. Like, in the book, when he time travels, he goes back to 1958, not 1960. So they cut his time almost in half.
Yeah, I did read the showrunner or the writer did specifically talk about that was a conscious decision, because they knew how many episodes they were working with, and they wanted to keep the show moving, and they knew how much time they already needed to stretch. Then they talk about how, in a lot of like time travel stuff, people go back and forth between timelines, but in this, like with the concept of he goes back and he has to remain there. I mean, you get some like flashback stuff of his conversations with Al, but he can't go back to the future because then if he goes back in, then he resets all he does. So it was a conscious decision, apparently, if they just wanted to condense the timeline so that they could keep the story moving while still spend a decent amount of time in the past without, I guess, probably making it feel like, oh, suddenly we're in 59, suddenly we're in 60, suddenly we're in 61. I get that concept of it. If you don't want to feel like you're breezing through the years, but you also want to spend as much time and keep the story running smooth.
I think just after having read the book now, I was like, oh, I don't like this as much as I did the first time around, for sure. And it was one of those things where I was going through it and I was like, oh, they actually changed way more than I thought they would for this story, because, Bill throws a wrench in the plans down the line because he falls in love with Marina, and he adds this whole element to the storyline that just did not exist and did not take Jake's attention away from what was happening.
Yeah, but I mean, I guess you're always going to notice stuff, in the books versus the adaptations. And there's always the endless debate of whether you like the book more, whether you like the movie more, the show more. I kind of think of it mostly and granted, I haven't read the book, but in rewatching the series again, still not having read the book, I was still just as enthralled with the storylines. I really enjoyed Bill's stuff. I like that he kind of gets involved in Oswald's life and kind of throws a wrench into that. And I kind of, when I think about it, think of like The Shining, where I love the book and I love the Stanley Kubrick movie. The Stanley Kubrick movie is not a perfect adaptation of The Shining of the book.
Oh, it's a terrible adaptation of the book.
But it's an incredible film. And so it's like I can kind of just enjoy them separately. And granted, I haven't read the book of this one, but that's kind of the mentality I would go into it with for myself. Is I think as an 8-episode TV series, I think this told a very compelling story that really falls onto a simple concept that really is probably a question that like so many people have sat around a fire and like talked about, of just like, if you could go back in time, what would you change? And who, it's everyone always, they even use it in the show. It's just like kill kill baby Hitler. It's like things like that. I would save JFK. So it's I think it works very well as even if it's streamlined in some places and changed from the book, at least as a TV series on its own, I think it works very well. Whereas sometimes on the Stephen King miniseries, regardless of whether or not it stays close to the book or different from the book, the series itself is still not very good. So this one kind of lucks out in, at least for me, still after all this time, very much enjoying it as a series.
I just ended up finding Bill extremely annoying by the end of, that whole situation at the apartment that him and Jake are sharing to surveil Lee Harvey Oswald, because he brings up this argument like, well, how come you get to date Sadie? And in my head, I was immediately like, well, Sadie isn't married to the guy who is being surveilled by you two.
Yeah, but I think it's very much, Bill's a guy who got himself roped into this insane time travel situation. And left this small town, comes to the city. You constantly see him just being way in over his head and the complete utter wrong person for this job.
But he didn't get roped into it. He volunteered because Jake tried to get him to go home.
Right. But it's like once you're in Bill's situation and he's like in this small town, and now all of a sudden it's like, oh my God, like time travel's real and I have a chance to do something great and get out of here.
But then he threw it all out the window. So
absolutely. But I think it's because he was the complete wrong person for the job, but he pushes himself along. Jake gives him a chance, several chances. And then finally he's way too much of a problem and Jake has to get him out of there. But then, of course, unfortunately, you have Jake. He's a good person, so he feels guilt about it once he, remembers it. But then he also needs him to help him get his memory back. So, I mean, I definitely agree. There are times that he certainly gets annoying because of how much he's like screwing things up. But I kind of feel like that's the point, and maybe it goes on too long. That's certainly possible. But yeah, I think it kind of worked and made sense overall, and that it's just like he just should not have been involved at all and didn't have the strength or the intelligence to care about really what was at stake. He's a selfish kid who just went in the big city and suddenly has all this stuff that he wants and then can't have, and then just gets pissed off at Jake for it. So he definitely had to go. But I can certainly understand it from the other side. And if he's not involved in the book, then it's just this thing that may feel like it goes on.
Well, he's also like in his 60s or something in the book. So he's like a totally different character. And I think this was the change I clearly did not like really at all after, having read the book. And, I vaguely remembered some of this from the first time I watched it. And I remember, still getting annoyed with Bill then too. But for me, it was a lot of the other characters like Sadie, Ms. Mimi, Deke, and a lot of that stayed very true to the book. And I think that's what kind of saves this adaptation a little for me because, we spend a lot of time away from Bill. It's just that when Jake is at the apartment, Bill has to be there because that's kind of, where he's living full time, whereas Jake is bouncing back and forth. So it was more so the story in Jody that appealed to me. Whereas, in the book, it's Jake doing all of this stuff by himself. And I think they could have made it work without Bill if they really wanted to. They would have just had to cut down the scenes or maybe focus more on what Marina and Lee were doing instead of focusing on, Jake in the apartment. So there are ways they could have made it work, but I get why they did add Bill. I'm just not a huge fan of it. But other story elements make up for it, like I said. So for you, how did you feel about the story in Jody in particular?
I absolutely loved it. I mean, I really like that at the core of all this, it's like I come to this series with an interest in Stephen King and an interest in JFK, the assassination. When I was a kid, we went to we drove cross country, and on the way we stopped through Dallas and went to the 6th floor museum. And so like that blew my mind, like all this crazy information and the stuff that doesn't add up, and then the stuff that kind of ties together and makes you want to grab like the red strings and put them up on the wall, which I really liked how they did that with like the credits. And even when they went to like a new location, it said like the name of the town or the time, there was like a little like red like piece of yarn under that faded away. But so it's like I came to the adaptation with those heavily in my interest. And so I'm like, oh, cool. It's going to be this dive into the conspiracies, and it's tied to Stephen King. But then when you spend all this time in Jody, the core of the story is a love story. And I think they handle it really well. I think so many of the characters are just so enjoyable to spend so much time with, especially Jake and Sadie. But I also really like his relationship with Deke. And, Deke is like basically trying to, he feels like Jake's this good guy and I'm going to like kind of take him under my wing. Then Jake screws up and he kind of just becomes this like, I don't know, like scolding father, like to him, like I can't believe you're doing this. And, but ultimately I like that they kind of like stick in his life, that even when Jake screws up and they kind of like separate from his life for a bit, when they come back into it, like, after she gets injured and then even after his accident, they're all at the hospital together. Really, I mean, Miss Mimi is such a great character. She's so funny with Jake. That is a hugely enjoyable part of the show. And so as much as I like, all the stuff with like the conspiracy and everything, I definitely agree with you that the Jody side of it is probably the strongest core of the show, and probably is supposed to be, because I think really even when you get to the end and everything, it's all about him wanting to get back to Sadie and coming to terms with leaving the life the way it is. So all around, that's done really well. The stuff with her ex-husband is terrifying.
And that's not to say that Jake doesn't also get in over his head, because
Yes.
we know from the start that traveling back in time to this time period where, he wasn't even born, he wasn't even a kid, during this time period. And you have that moment in the phone booth where he's trying to call his dad, and you get all this weird feedback, and then someone crashes into the phone booth and stuff. And you also have the fact that he knows who wins all the fights in what round, whether it's a knockout or what. And you have that whole scenario with the bookies, and there are just so many things that add this element of tension and fear for Jake and even Sadie at times because of, like you said, her husband. And it's one of those stories where you can tell that the accuracy of the real historical events adds another layer to it that we don't normally get. But because Jody is a small town as well, and everyone knows everyone talks and gossips, it still feels like a Stephen King story, even though you're adding all of these real life events in and you're sort of just twisting them to fit this fictional narrative. And I really liked how that still came across in the adaptation, because they keep saying over and over again, it's the past pushing back, and obviously, you can't time travel. You can't change the past. But the way that it is presented here, it's like, okay, if you could time travel, this is probably what would happen.
Yeah, I really, really, really dug how they present time travel in this show, and I love how there are like real true like moments of like thriller and horror like in this show that feel very Stephen King. It's sometimes I feel like you start watching something like this, or if you were to read the synopsis of it, you might think, oh, this is probably more along the lines of like Shawshank type Stephen King or Green Mile type Stephen King, because you're not necessarily going to expect that those horror elements will be as strong as they are. But there were things in this that it's just, you shouldn't be here. The car crashing into it. It's such a cool and I feel like unique idea of the past pushing back, and that especially that there are these moments in time that are so key to history that the closer you get to that moment, the more time pushes back. He could probably hang out back in time, and as long as he's not really messing with stuff, time's probably not going to bother him. But, it's when you get to them, rushing, on the actual day, and they're like rushing through the crowd, the car chases after them and crashes into the bus. As they're going through the crowd, they're seeing people from their past. It's such a very cool and well done take on time travel, and that's probably one of my favorite things about this series and this story. And then especially when they dive into with I don't know if do we ever get the name of the guy who keeps saying to him like, you shouldn't be here?
No, he's just known as the Yellow Card Man.
Okay. So with him, I really like that concept of, and you get more of an understanding of it in the end when Jake first goes back of this. It's got you stuck in the loop. It's got you hooked. That's a really cool idea of just like Jake learned his lesson essentially of like, oh my gosh, like I shouldn't have changed the past. Let me go back. But then you see the potential of what could happen, like with this guy, he is just so hooked in, almost like a drug, and just cannot get out of it, and will just forever be trying to fix this and never can. And that in itself is truly horrific.
Yeah, I think a lot of the story elements did come together really well in the end. And, by that time, spoiler here for anyone who hasn't seen this, Bill has committed suicide. And then it's like they finally get back to Jake's goal and his mission. And you see him rushing to, not only remember everything, but just to get it done in time, because it's like, this is a thing where it's not, oh, it's okay if you're 5 minutes late,
When the accident happens and now it's like, oh, he has to get his memory back. That was a point in the show that, at least on this watch, as it was like unraveling, I started to wonder. I'm like, oh no. I was like, is this gonna like slow? Is this gonna like slow things down? Of just, oh, now we kind of have to like catch up on things, and we need and I was a little nervous about it, but I think because of the surrounding of the rest of the ensemble helping him figure things out and their performances, I think is what keeps that so interesting, because I feel like that type of aspect to the story of just like, oh, of course, like now he's lost his memory and he's got to get it back. I feel like that can go wrong so easily, but they did it nicely, and they didn't spend too much time on it. But I do feel, and I can't speak for this because I haven't read the book, but I feel like with a show, you probably have to like hurry it along a bit more, where maybe with the book, because you can kind of get into his head, maybe you can spend more time with it and flesh that out. So I'm not sure how that part like played out with the book.
Well, as far as, the scenes at the apartment by Lee and Marina, you see Jake interacting with people maybe a little more. And, they had that scenario where the guy came in and stole all of the equipment and stuff like that. But you have just a little more going on in the book with, Jake in that scenario, because Bill isn't there. But at the same time, like you said, you can't really have him just in his head all the time. So it makes sense that they gave him someone living in the apartment to talk to. But I feel like there's so much in the book that maybe doesn't necessarily directly affect the end goal in this, or the end result, if you will, but was still interesting to read. Like the whole thing with Derry, I was like, okay, this is King making this larger connection to this universe, because to ignore the fact that certain characters existed in Derry during that time period, especially because in the book Jake goes back to 1958. It's like, that's way too close to just ignore that these kids are there.
Right.
So moving that, it kind of changes the dynamic and how important Maine is to the story.
Yeah, I think the focus of the show definitely ties way more into Texas, and Maine is just kind of the destination home aspect to it. The Wizard of Oz, no place from home type thing.
I want to say like a third of the book took place in Maine, though. That's a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for necessarily what was in the book. It just that it seems like the show directed most of the focus to Texas, and left Maine as this connection that he makes with Sadie on a personal level, and the fact that it is his eventual true destination to head home. So it's, I mean, I definitely would have been all for it if if the show spent way more time in Maine. I would have been all for it if the show was longer. Maybe if it was multiple. Well, I guess it's hard to do multiple seasons, because it's then, it's, especially when you set a timeline on it, where you have to get to the assassinated JFK. It's like with a TV series, you can't drag that, as the audience is starting to get it. Will start to get annoyed, or general audiences at least. Someone who's steeped into Stephen King or this type of storytelling would likely be really into it. But
I mean, they spend like a full episode or two in Kentucky, so it's like they could have just kept that as Derry, and it would have, I think, been more effective as a tie to the Stephen King universe as a whole. And, we discussed that already, but to talk about Holden and go back a little here. That's where Harry's family is, and in the present day, we see that Harry is part of the GED program that Jake is teaching because he needs the extra money. He's going through a divorce. So he has this personal stuff going on. And then he's thrown into this and he's like, okay, well, what can I do that would help this person who I specifically know in my time? And you see how by the end of it, how wrong things go, even though he tried to do the right thing. And it just goes to show that you can't really accurately play the what if game. Sure, plenty of people have had this story run through their head. What if JFK wasn't assassinated?
Mm-hmm.
King obviously took the liberty to write down his version of events, but it's like no one is going to know. No one will ever know. You can't change it. And this book just goes to show that even if you have the best of intentions, things aren't always going to go the way you want them to, or the way that, in this case, Al wants them to in particular. And there are just so many events where Jake is doing the right thing. And, having read the book and us having watched this already, we kind of, we know how it's going to end. But what did you think of, one, the scenes in Holden where he's trying to help Harry as a small child, and then two, the ending, because we see how it directly affected Harry in particular. So I think these two things kind of tie together nicely.
Yeah, I really dug his trip to Holden to try and help his colleague, and especially when we know from the back into the present time that he knows, even though he tried to help him he's like, oh, I'm going to write this letter of recommendation. That doesn't help him. So when he's back in the past, and I feel like especially unraveling with the idea that things aren't working the way they're supposed to, and he feels like he just has this need that I need to fix something. If I can't fix this, I'm going to fix this then. And he knows when he sees in the map, then he can go to Holden. And so I really like how it's like this moment of desperation of him just trying to prove I can fix this. I can fix someone's life for the better. And I think as he's getting into that storyline, it's done really well. As we were talking about how he gets himself in over his head, I think as he starts having a conversation with the father, and especially when they go to like the slaughterhouse, which is definitely that in that level of thriller horror, like that scenes. I mean, that's a like really tense. I like that. Yeah, he wants to help Harry, but maybe there was a lot more to this than I expected. But he's already in it, and he's got to do it, and he knows that I have to pull this off, and it of course goes horribly wrong. But I think he feels like, all right, at least I helped. And then as they tie that into the end, it is incredibly emotional how that's handled. That almost like when you first see him in the new present time where everything's a disaster, you start to think, or Jake's thinking, well, he's still here, and maybe even though I'll figure out what the heck happened. I saved JFK. Things were supposed to get better. I'll figure out all that. But hey, maybe at least I did the right thing with him. When he starts to realize maybe I shouldn't have saved JFK, the fact that he's also realizing maybe I shouldn't have stopped his family from being murdered. And that's incredibly heart-wrenching. But, when Harry breaks down and he's like, you killed him, but he was a bad person, but he was my dad. To just think of it from that aspect, and him knowing that even if he goes back to fix like the JFK thing, I think that is a really nice touchstone, because I think that lesson leads to him making the ultimate decision of, I can't make my life with Sadie work either, because I can't fix the JFK thing. I can't fix Harry's life. If I try and be selfish and make my life with Sadie, who knows what that ripples into the future. And I think the Harry story is really, really key to his inevitable realization of what the right decision is. And that's done really well.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, because without him wanting to do this extra task, basically, of his own volition, you wouldn't have that same feeling that, okay, yes, Jake is inherently this good guy who, is maybe down on his luck a little, wants to do something nice for someone else that would impact their life in a hopefully positive way. But when you learn it didn't, and plus then you have everything with JFK factoring in on top of that, you just go back to this present day that is fairly apocalyptic, really. It's not like there's zombies and things like that, but you have these kids who are going around beating up people. You have this lady on her bike and he's asking her what year it is and things like this when he gets back. But, it really just ends in a way where you have that happen and he's like, okay, I have to undo everything I just spent years, but really only 2 minutes doing because time travel. And you see how much he loses by having to do that. But at the same time, he's restoring things to a better place. So even though he's going to lose that relationship with Sadie, I mean, he will remember it, but it's something she won't remember. And, at the same time, it brings her back to life because, spoiler, she dies too. And, it's such a nice ending, though, that he resets it and then he finds older Sadie in Jody still. And she's receiving the Woman of the Year award and they're putting on this little party for her. And it's just a sweet ending. And honestly, King could have ended it with him going back, realizing everything was terrible, and just cutting it off there.
And honestly, when in my memory of the series, that's where it ends. When he comes out of it, and then I thought I remembered it just like when he's like, what the fuck happened to the diner? And I thought I remembered because the diner was destroyed, he couldn't go back or something. And so my memory had it kind of in that much darker ending, which frankly, I agree. I would have kind of expected Stephen King's ending to just be a bit more dour of the lesson here is, leave the past alone because you could destroy the world, and so it is a much more positive and heartfelt and bittersweet ending. The other stuff with the ending that I liked falls into with the Oswald stuff. I feel like you very easily Stephen King could have given his own answers to why Oswald was doing it. He could have gone the route of answering questions of, oh, there was a second gunner and this is who it was and this is how this happened. He could have given all those answers. And there's a part of me when I'm watching it where I'm like, man, I want those answers. I want that big conspiracy reveal. But when I sit back and I just think about the storytelling, it's done so much better by when he's in the car with the FBI guy.
Hosty.
Yeah. And he's just like, here you are, you're this hero, you saved JFK, you could have everything, but you just want your privacy. And he's like, so I just want to know, it's why do you think Oswald did it? And for him to just say, I don't think we'll ever know. And just leaving the history at that, I thought was a really smart choice, because I think the easy conspiracy excitement answer definitely would have been, oh, he did it for this reason and all these people were involved. But I like the subtle ending with that then you can wrap up that part of the story. So that way you can just then focus on Jake and Sadie at the end without having the punch be the conspiracy, because it's not really about the conspiracy. That's the driving force of what gets us going, and then it digs so much deeper in all these different directions.
Yeah, I think overall this was fine. I'm probably not going to revisit it for a third time, though, now that I've seen it twice. And after having read the book, I think I would probably much rather revisit the book at some point versus this. But I'm hoping that they still keep putting things out on Hulu, because I think they have an interesting thing going here between this and then what they did with Castle Rock, which was not a direct adaptation of anything, but it got to play in the Stephen King universe. And I do like having a mini series that doesn't need to be more than 8 or 10 episodes. It's like you're in for a season and then you're done. Whereas some things in the past have gone on way too long, like the Under the Dome or the Dead Zone shows.
Yeah, I can definitely say I haven't watched those. I'm definitely more positive on the the series overall. But who knows? After I read the book, I may feel differently. But I agree. Like, just give me more. And whether it's straight adaptations of things, do them as limited series, or even. I'm personally pretty disappointed that we didn't get a third season of Castle Rock, because that was definitely a fun world to play in, where they tied seasons together, kind of.
Yeah.
But overall, you got to spend time in this original take that also kind of fit into things, like especially season 2. Like after watching season 2 and then recently watching the movie Misery again, it was like having that show in my head, even though I'm like, I don't think that's necessarily canon, but it kind of like adds to it for me. And I thought that was pretty cool. And season 3 would have been awesome, but they canceled it, and that's dumb.
I'd give this a 3 out of 5, though. Like, I didn't absolutely hate it, but I think Bill's character brought it down a lot for me.
I definitely get that. Especially a scene in the book that you really, really, really like, and see that gets chucked away and then replaced by a story that you don't necessarily like. I can definitely understand that. And some of the stuff with Bill certainly does go on too long, and it's kind of like, how much can he really screw this up? But overall, I never know how to rank these things, but I'd probably still give it like a 4 out of 5. I'd probably keep that 1 star away for some of the things that it definitely could have paced better. You mentioned the guy. There's like the moment with when Sadie uncovers like the recording in the basement.
Mm-hmm.
There's a guy that moves like in the back in the shadows. And I don't know if that was ever addressed, or we just supposed to assume it was the FBI.
I thought it was her husband.
Ah, okay.
Because when he signed the divorce papers, he left a note, he's not who you think he is.
That's right. Yeah. That would make sense. Okay.
And I don't think the FBI knew about Jake at that point in time.
Yeah. All right. So I'll take that criticism away. But but still, yeah. Overall, just really solid series. If you haven't watched it and you listen to all this, I'm sorry.
There's still a lot.
There's still a lot we didn't cover.
But again, with the whole James Franco thing too, if you don't want to watch this, we totally get it.
Also get that. Yeah. I will say, I think he does a very nice job with the character. On this watch, I felt like his performance was weaker than I remembered in certain spots.
He's not the most interesting character with the way this adaptation was done, in my opinion.
Okay. Well, then that excites me to jump into the book and see more from the character. So yeah, definitely enjoyed it. Thoroughly enjoyed talking about it, as always. And I had a good time.
Yeah, you'll have to let me know your thoughts when you get around to reading the book, which I understand can take a while. Not everyone flies through these things like I do. And, even lately I've been in like this slump for reading because I've just been busy doing other things. And I'm like, I really need to read, but I also don't feel like thinking right now. So trust me, I get it, especially with a book as long as 11/22/63. But Tim, thank you for joining me to discuss this adaptation. I'm actually kind of glad we didn't completely agree on it. It seems we do that a lot. So it was nice to have that little discussion there about Bill.
Yeah. Absolutely. Always a good time. Happy to be here.
All right, that does it for this episode of Chat Sematary. You can support the podcast on Patreon for $1 a month. You'll get a thank you on the show. For $2 a month, I will send you a Chat Sematary sticker. And if you want to follow us on social media, you can do so at Chat Sematary on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You could also rate and review the show. That's a huge help. And as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.